Since the relatively recent reboot of Animaniacs and Tiny Toon Adventures, I've been thinking more and more about postmodernism. The news of two of my childhood favorites being resurrected reinvigorated my interest in the subject and got me thinking about all the other great examples of postmodern brilliance sitting right under our noses. My first exposure to postmodernism came during my childhood, but my formal education on the subject didn't happen until a few years ago when I took a class on postmodernism in college. Since then, I've been mightily obsessed with the subject. I keep finding postmodernism all around me, in TV shows and books and comics and commercials. I start feeling like Neo, finally being able to see the Matrix. My purpose here is not so much to define what postmodernism is, that would be a fool's errand, but rather to examine the techniques used in some of what I consider to be masterpieces of postmodern art to create very specific artistic effects. I want you to see the Matrix as I do. Each of the pieces that I hope to examine in this series all utilize similar techniques and skills that aim to blur the lines between reality and fiction. To introduce ourselves to these topics, we will begin by critiquing both Animaniacs and Tiny Toon Adventures together. Why together, you may ask? Well, you see, it was no accident that Spielberg decided to reboot these two series together. If you think about it, he really had no other choice. These two series represent two opposing sides of the postmodern coin. To put it simply, you can't have Animaniacs without Tiny Toon Adventures, and you can't have Tiny Toon Adventures without Animaniacs. Not really, anyways. To lay the foundation of our analysis, we will examine the respective settings of these two shows, those being the Warner Brothers movie lot in Animaniacs and Acme Acres in Tiny Toon Adventures. For those unfamiliar with the format of these shows, they are both hosted by their respective main characters from these respective settings, somewhat in the same vein as the variety shows of old. Think Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis hosting from the studio, only here the hosts introduce cartoon shorts, kind of like the old talkie theaters where the original Looney Tunes shorts were broadcast. At any rate, the settings of these two shows represent the two opposing sides of the postmodern coin that I mentioned earlier. Starting with Acme Acres, first and always introduced to us in the opening theme song of the show, this initial image tells us everything we need to know. It is presented as a, quote, cartoon work of art and shown to be a painting complete with an elaborate frame and Babs and Buster Bunny standing at its flanks dressed as fancy art critics. This place is a fictional setting in every sense of the word. The setting of Animaniacs, on the other hand, the Warner movie lot, is in every way a non-fiction place that you or I could theoretically visit. By setting these shows on opposite ends of a spectrum ranging from fiction to reality and then using some specific literary techniques that we'll explore in a moment, an interesting flow of tension is created, sort of like an osmotic flow, or perhaps like the string slipping through the stationary beads of a bracelet. Tiny Toon Adventures seeks to pull reality into the fictional world, whereas Animaniacs seeks to push fiction into the real world. This flow of tension, whichever direction it may be, is, in my opinion, the overarching purpose of postmodernism. Let's take a look at how it works. Now that we have established the importance of the setting point and presentation, we will begin examining the literary techniques used in these two shows, those being pastiche/parody, mosaic allegory, and self-reference. Other techniques common to postmodernism are used in these and other shows, but since these three techniques are used most prominently in these shows, we will limit our conversation to just them for now. Besides, if we tried to cover all of the techniques used in these shows, we'd be here for a year at least. Regardless of that, this is meant to be an introduction to these concepts to be built upon in the future. Let's begin with the easiest and most obvious, parody and pastiche. For our example, we needn't look any further than the opening scene/teaser for the rebooted Animaniacs. Here we get treated to an almost word-for-word, shot-for-shot recreation of one of the most iconic scenes in cinematic history, the very first introduction to the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park. We see the scene play out just like we remember it. Spielberg himself makes an appearance as John Hammond, representing his own artistic intentions, and while Hulu makes an appearance as the lawyer representing their financial intentions. Out of the distance, the Warner Brothers and the Warner sister materialize, resurrected just like the dinosaurs of old. Now, you may be forgiven for thinking that the inclusion of this particular scene is meant to be a tie-in with the recent Jurassic World series. However, I would argue that the intentions behind this decision have more to do with recapturing the majesty of the moment. Not exactly nostalgia, but something similar and a bit more complex. In order to fully understand the choice to parody this particular scene as the introduction to the rebooted Animaniacs, we have to go back to the brown carpet of my childhood living room floor circa 1994. Back to a time before widespread internet usage, before the wonders of Walking with Dinosaurs, Ice Age, or Disney's Dinosaurs. Way back to a time before it was even widely accepted that birds evolved from dinosaurs. Remember the 6-foot turkey kid, or Timmy? I'm digressing. I say all of that to say this. The first Jurassic Park movie was a really big deal. That may seem like an obvious statement, but I don't think it's as obvious a statement now as it was back then. And that detail was what Spielberg was really trying to capitalize on, the majesty of the moment. That's the point of parody and pastiche. He was banking on the fact that this scene is so iconic and so well known that it itself has become a cliche of itself. The scene has become in its own way a part of our reality. We have literally changed the way we think about dinosaurs because of this movie. By nesting the Animaniacs in a near-perfect recreation of the Jurassic Park scene, Spielberg allows the fiction of the Jurassic Park scene to become a de facto reality and therefore subverts our perception of reality itself. It's this subversion of reality that really catalyzes our flow of tension. A quick footnote. I know I'm using the terms parody and pastiche interchangeably. For our purposes here, I'm allowing myself to do that. Just know that they're different and that I do plan on exploring the subtle differences between them in future episodes. Now that we have explored the role of parody and pastiche when it comes to establishing our flow of tension, we can take the next logical step and begin our analysis of mosaic allegory. Don't worry, as soon as I define this term, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's really as simple as breaking down and defining these two terms separately. A mosaic being a mix of images to create a bigger image. And if you remember from high school English, an allegory is an extended metaphor. You might now be wondering what's the difference between a mosaic and an allegory. They sound like the same thing, only one is written, the other is graphic. And you're right, they are similar. However, when working together, they become more effective than either could be on its own. Mosaic allegory is kind of like one of those jigsaw puzzles of a jigsaw puzzle. Also postmodern, by the way, self-reference. Anyway, for our example, we're going to stick with the Animaniacs, but we're going to shift our focus to the Goodfeathers. Don't worry, I'll be touching more on Tiny Toon Adventures in the next analysis. Anyone familiar with the Goodfeathers should immediately start to understand how this technique works. For those of us who aren't familiar, Goodfeathers is a series of cartoon shorts that follow 3 pigeons living in New York City. Here is where the allegory comes into play. These 3 Goodfeathers, Squit, Pesto, and Bobby, each have their own corresponding good fella from whom they draw inspiration. Henry Hill, Tommy DeVito, and Jimmy Conway, respectively. That's easy enough to understand. Now let's add in the mosaic portion. Not only does Goodfeathers tap into the New York gangster culture particular to Goodfellas, it goes further to fold in elements from other cinematic examples of this same culture. The Goodfeathers answer to their boss, the God Pigeon. Squid falls in love with Carluta in the middle of a turf war. Bobby tests his might in the ring, and the list goes on. It doesn't end with fiction either. New York City itself exists as the setting of the show, and the Goodfeathers often perch atop a statue of Martin Scorsese. You have probably noticed that this technique of mosaic allegory is remarkable to what we just discussed with parody and pastiche, and you're right. In fact, parody and pastiche are both separately integral, but not necessary to creating an effective mosaic allegory. However, mosaic allegory takes parody and pastiche a few steps further, adding complexity to these otherwise relatively simple techniques. Every element of Goodfeathers works together to create a larger, more complex image. These cartoons are a weaving together of reality and fiction, each with their threads running in opposite directions. As you may have guessed, it's this weaving quality with its threads running in so many different directions that creates the friction necessary to catalyze our flow of tension. Now let's turn our attention to self-reference and take a look at the theme song of Tiny Toon Adventures. Bear with me here. I know this might seem like cheating to continue to use the theme song sequence for our evidence, but remember, when doing these analyses, we have to fundamentally change the way we think to accommodate the effects of postmodernism. Think of it this way. The theme song of Tiny Toon Adventures or any other show is literally the only segment featured in every single episode of the show without fail or alteration. It is what we expect from our television shows, even though there is no law saying that a theme song is necessary. If you really think about it, theme songs are a weird artifact of television. Most new shows don't even bother with them, and indeed many shows of the 90s that prominently featured a theme song did away with it in later seasons to make more room for plot. Unlike other shows, however, the theme sequence in Tiny Toon Adventures doesn't bother with opening credits, instead crediting the legacy of the Looney Tunes for its creation, and rightfully so. It also does a few other things differently from more traditional theme songs by making 32 references to itself in 1 minute. That's an average of one self-reference every 2 seconds for the entirety of the song. That's a fevered pace. They tell the audience not only who they are, but also specific characteristics of each character, even the obscure ones, where they are, what they will be doing, how you feel about it, and then to top it all off, they even tell us when the theme song is over, as if the music stopping wasn't enough of a clue. But obviously, I can hear you saying, it's the job of the theme to introduce the audience to the show, usher newcomers to comfortable seats, and reassure old fans that nothing's changed. You can feel safe here. Like a book cover, right? Well, I guess if the book cover had a complete listing of each character along with their purpose in the story, a description of the setting, a plot synopsis, a description of how much you will like it, and something at the bottom letting the reader know that the bottom of the cover is indeed the end of it. To be fair, most of these things exist in some form and configuration or another on most book covers. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any book cover that quite achieves everything the Tiny Toon Adventures theme song achieves. To put it simply, this theme song is a demonstration of our expectation of reality being fed back to us in a loop. Kind of like that snake that eats its own tail. Postmodernism before modernism. Figure that one out. Like the techniques we examined earlier, self-reference relies on subverting our perception of reality, but it does so by leveraging off of reality at a different point on the spectrum, a point located closer to fiction than it is to reality. Once again, subverting our perception sets up the perfect environment for our flow of tension to occur, this time in the direction pushing fiction into the real world as we discussed before. Alright, now that all that's out of the way, that leaves one last lingering question that must be burning in your hearts by now. Who cares? Why bother going through all this trouble to find ways to subvert reality and establish a flow of tension? It's all terribly complicated, right? Besides, plain old fiction has a proven track record of being entertaining enough, so why do it? Won't change how mustard tastes, right? Well, when it comes to art, the answer to that question will be different for everyone. I can only offer my own answer and hope that this analysis helps you reach yours. When I was young, I to belong to a military family. We had lived in a few places before we settled in a small town in the middle of Arizona where my father had been stationed as a recruiter. I was well traveled as much as a child in the second grade could be. Upon moving to this new place, my life ground to a sudden crawl. My new world was now being measured in acres rather than blocks. No longer did we have next-door neighbors because the nearest neighbor's door was a quarter of a mile away. The summers there were long, hot, and boring. It was both wholesome and terribly isolating. Our escape came in two forms, video games and television. Our life force revolved around the zenith in the living room. We spent many afternoons sitting or lying on the brown shag carpet, toiling away at games or absorbing whatever we could tune in clearly on the antenna. Anyone who was a child throughout the 80s and into the early 90s can tell you that children's programming of this era wasn't terribly sophisticated. Every protagonist had his antagonist, the good guy always won, and you better believe there was a toy line available exclusively from Galoob to enhance your viewing experience. These attempts at serious children's entertainment usually fell flat because these decisions were made with no artistic intention, only financial intention. Don't get me wrong, falling flat doesn't necessarily mean unsuccessful. I was even taken in by the siren song of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In fact, Donatello was a personal hero of mine both in kindergarten and in the first grade. No, falling flat means that they failed to challenge our outlook on life. They failed to introduce us to an opposing point of view that we could be left to ponder on our own. But I knew in my limited way that there was a world beyond the hills and mountains that framed our little valley. It was indeed time for Animaniacs. Animaniacs and the Tiny Toon Adventures were a big deal to me because, for the first time outside of movies, these were two cartoon shows that my mom wanted to watch with me and my brothers. She enjoyed these shows just as much as we did, but for far different reasons, and we knew it, and so did she, and that was special. We were all interacting with these shows in our own ways. We were free to bring our unique perspective to explain references that may have been missed by someone else. I remember many times jokes or references sailing right over my head, only to hear my mom giggling away behind me. Sometimes she would explain why it was funny, but more often she didn't bother. We simply wouldn't get it. I was amazed that my mom was having a completely different experience than I was when we watched the exact same thing. Obviously, this was always the case, but these two shows seemed to amplify the effect enough for us to notice it. Postmodernism, I think, works to show us that there isn't really any separation between fiction, perception, and reality. There's no difference between art and consciousness. They are all the same layer on the same plane that our thoughts exist. Alright, that's going to do it for this episode. I have many ideas for the future, so stay tuned. I plan to look at some of my favorites like Community, Arrested Development, The Office, both US and UK for different reasons, South Park, 30 Rock, Warhol, Nabokov, Tarantino, Moulin Rouge, one of my absolute favorite movies in the world, Deadpool, Weekly World News, and so many that I can't even think of right now. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please let me know.